So good morning again. Maybe we can close the door there at the back once the last colleague has joined us. Very pleased to see so many of you here, distinguished delegates of the parties to the UNFCCC, representatives of the international community, dear colleagues and friends. I'm really happy to welcome you to this side event on climate finance tracking. My name is Henning Wüster. I'm the director of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and we are extremely honored to be able to co-organize this event together with our co-hosts, the government of the Ivory Coast, of Côte d'Ivoire, the Center for Clean Air Policy, CCAP, and ClimateNet. And I'm very happy that we will have I can assure you that we will have a really exciting agenda today. We will start with some opening remarks from our hosts from the Ivory Coast, and then we'll go through a panel discussion with speakers from various countries that are working on climate finance tracking. But before going there, we will have a keynote presentation of the methodology that ICAT is developing together with our partners. So let me briefly give you an introduction to why we are organizing this event here at the COP. This is really the COP of implementation, and the focus is very much on getting things done. Of course, a focus has been the global stocktake, and the short message from the global stocktake has been that the Paris Agreement is not on track. So finance is very central to all of that, to implementation and to bringing the Paris Agreement back on track. And it's no surprise that finance, as almost every year, plays a very central role in the final negotiations that are unfolding today and tomorrow. And probably some of those that could have been with us here today will spend their time in the negotiations. ICAT focuses on transparency, and transparency is really the backbone of the Paris Agreement. It is, in my view, one of the key elements that can bring the Paris Agreement back on track. And to put it very simply, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And this very clearly also applies to climate finance. The Paris Agreement will need, in order to succeed, a fundamental transformation of economies. And of course, all of that will require significant amounts of finance in all countries worldwide. Clearly, we are talking about finance from a broad mix of sources. We are talking about finance from public and private sectors, from domestic and international sources. Just to illustrate that, if you look at renewable energy finance, which is a core pillar of the energy transformation, 80% is private finance, and a big part of that has to come from domestic sources. So understanding that broad mix of finance is, in our view, critical in order to succeed. ICAT supports developing countries. That's why we were set up at the time of the Paris Agreement, and we are very happy to work with over 50 countries across all continents. One of the topics that we have picked up recently is climate finance tracking. The reporting requirements for climate finance are not important. There are some reporting requirements regarding to international support, very important reporting requirements regarding finance needed for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. What we encourage countries to do is to take a holistic approach. to really look at all the sources and all the financial flows in their countries to really understand how to manage climate finance in their countries. If you want to be in the driver's seat, you need to understand the big picture and not look at isolated elements of that picture. A big problem at the moment is that climate finance is dominated by isolated project finance. That is really currently the focus that we see in many developing countries, and the kind of transformation that the Paris Agreement requires will not happen with isolated projects. It requires a broad approach, it requires a programmatic approach, and individual projects funded through loans from the Green Climate Fund or from multilateral development banks will not achieve the fundamental transformation required. It will not help modernize economies to be ready for the 21st century when the world shifts to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy, and the risk is that countries are left behind in the economy of the 20th century rather than to be part of the modern framework. So this holistic perspective on climate finance is really critical, and that's why we've developed a guide on climate finance transparency. It will be published in the course of 2024, but the framework is already ready and you will hear about it shortly. ICAT is very pleased to partner with CCAP that leads the work on the methodology, and with GaussInternational that leads the work on country applications. And we are extremely happy that we are able to work with 4 countries. 2 of them are here with us. Hopefully, by the time we have the panel discussions, 3 of them will be with us. The 4 countries are Côte d'Ivoire, Belize, Senegal, and Morocco. And more have already requested support and will join us on that topic very soon. But I'm also pleased that we have some climate finance expert institutions represented here at the side event, because what we want to make sure is that what we are developing is consistent with what others are doing, and because we wouldn't do a very good service to developing countries if we come with inconsistent support, and therefore we are making every effort to be aligned across different approaches. So that brings me to the objectives of the event today. We first of all want to hear from countries what they see as the needs and challenges in terms of climate finance tracking. What are their expectations and priorities? And then we want to discuss also from an expert perspective how a climate finance transparency framework can help to address these needs. So with that, let me move to inviting our first speaker. And I'm really honored to be able to invite Dr. Kaku Kwa, who is the technical advisor to the Minister of Economy, Planning and Development of Côte d'Ivoire. Dr. Kwa is also Vice Chairman of the National Commission for Sustainable Development, negotiator on behalf of Côte d'Ivoire, and Vice Chairman of the National Commission. Dr. Kwa has a long and distinguished career in both national and international administrations, and we are really honored to have him here, especially at this very busy period of the negotiations. Donc, Dr. Kwa, vous avez la parole.
Je vais m'exprimer en français. Et désolé pour la langue. Je crois que le traducteur ou la traductrice fera l'effort de bien traduire ce que je vais dire. Monsieur le directeur l'a indiqué tout à l'heure, je suis Dr Croix. Je suis conseiller de Madame Kabanyale, ministre de l'économie, du plan et du développement de la Côte d'Ivoire. Et je suis là aujourd'hui, certes au nom de la Côte d'Ivoire, mais au nom de Monsieur le ministre de l'Environnement, du Développement durable et de la Transition écologique, Monsieur Assaoré Jean-Jacques, qui s'excuse pour d'autres contraintes. Il a dû retourner en Côte d'Ivoire, également avec le directeur de cabinet. Donc, cette lourde charge de prononcer la locution de Monsieur le ministre. Merci. Monsieur le directeur de l'initiative pour la transparence de l'action climatique, Monsieur le représentant de ClimateNet et son représentant, Monsieur le directeur du financement climatique du Centre pour la politique de l'air pur ou son représentant, Madame le directeur de cabinet GaussInternational ou son représentant, Madame le chef de division changement climatique du ministère de l'Environnement et du Développement durable du Sénégal ou son représentant, Madame la responsable du service de l'économie verte du ministère de la Transition climatique, de la transition énergétique et du développement durable du Maroc, Monsieur le directeur du changement climatique, Bureau national du changement climatique, ministère du développement durable, du changement climatique, de la gestion des risques du catastrophe de Belize, Mesdames et Messieurs les participants à cet événement, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis du climat, en vos rangs, grades et qualités. C'est pour moi un insigne honneur et un réel plaisir de prendre la parole pour prononcer au nom de Monsieur le ministre de l'Environnement, du Développement durable et de la Transition écologique de la Côte d'Ivoire, Monsieur Assaoré Jacques, le discours d'ouverture de l'événement parallèle officiel de la COP 28 sur le thème « Transparence du financement climatique, un cadre harmonisé pour mobiliser les financements publics et privés ». Je voudrais, au nom de la délégation ivoirienne, saluer toutes les personnalités présentes à cet événement. Aussi, voudrais-je témoigner la reconnaissance de la Côte d'Ivoire aux organisateurs à cet événement sur le financement climatique. Mes remerciements vont particulièrement à l'endroit des institutions suivantes. D'abord, Monsieur le directeur de l'ICAT d'avoir accepté non seulement l'adhésion de la Côte d'Ivoire en 2021 en tant que pays membre de votre initiative et aussi en acceptant de l'accompagner financièrement pour la mise en œuvre des MRV du financement climatique. Ensuite, le Bureau des Nations Unies pour les services d'appui au projet UNFOR, l'organe opérationnel des projets ICAT. Aussi, le Centre pour la politique de l'air pur qui a voulu associer la Côte d'Ivoire à cet événement important sur le financement climatique et en honorant notre pays pour prononcer le discours d'ouverture. Enfin, nos remerciements vont à l'endroit du cabinet GaussInternational, le partenaire technique de la mise en œuvre du système MRV du financement climatique au niveau de notre pays. Mesdames et Messieurs, la Côte d'Ivoire a soumis ses CDN révisés au Secrétariat des Nations Unies en mai 2022 avec une ambition rehaussée de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de 30,41% d'ici 2030. Ces CDN comprennent globalement 38 mesures d'atténuation, dont 27 inconditionnelles et 11 conditionnelles pour lesquelles notre pays a besoin de soutien extérieur aussi bien au niveau du secteur privé que public. À l'instar donc du Sénégal, du Maroc, du Belize et de tous les pays en développement, la Côte d'Ivoire nourrit beaucoup d'espoir pour le financement des mesures conditionnelles de ces CDN, ainsi que son adaptation aux impacts du changement climatique, dont le plan national d'adaptation validé ce mois de novembre estimé à environ 18 milliards de dollars. Ces objectifs ne sauraient être atteints sans l'établissement d'un cadre de confiance et de transparence avec les partenaires techniques et financiers. En Côte d'Ivoire, grâce à l'ICAT, un plan de travail a été élaboré avec l'appui du cabinet Gauss pour développer et de mettre en œuvre un système MRV pour faire le suivi du financement climatique à différentes fins, notamment répondre aux exigences des déclarations en vertu de la Convention des Nations Unies et de l'accord de Paris et pour la prise en charge de la décision politique. Le système MRV conçu pour la Côte d'Ivoire devrait, entre autres, permettre de pouvoir fournir la fourniture et la réception de l'aide climatique, évaluer les besoins financiers de la Côte d'Ivoire, suivre les résultats obtenus, évaluer l'impact et rendre compte des résultats de la Convention des Nations Unies. Ces résultats, dans l'ensemble, devaient permettre ainsi à notre pays d'honorer ses engagements, mais également nous aider à la mobilisation des financements souhaités. Mesdames et messieurs, avant de clore mon propos, je voudrais une fois encore saluer les efforts des partenaires techniques et financiers pour la bonne tenue de cet événement qui nous réunit ce jour. C'est avec un ardent souhait de voir cette rencontre atteindre son objectif que, au nom de Monsieur le ministre de l'Environnement, du Développement durable et de la Transition écologique de la Côte d'Ivoire, Monsieur Assaoré Konan Jacques, je déclare ouvert l'événement parallèle officiel de la COP 28 sous le thème « Transparence du financement climatique, un cadre harmonisé pour mobiliser les financements publics et privés ». Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Kwa, and please convey our special thanks and gratitude to the Honourable Minister for these very, very important opening remarks. And I want to add from the perspective of ICAT that we are extremely honoured to be able to work with your country, and we very much look forward to engaging very actively and effectively with your team, which has already proven to be extremely capable and responsive. So thank you again, and please convey our gratitude to the Honourable Minister. So with that, we are really pleased now to welcome our next speaker. That will be Mr. Michael Köhler. He is representing ClimateNet here. He holds a degree in industrial engineering, focusing on renewable energy and environmental management, has over 10 years of experience in the field of energy and climate change. He has worked on wind energy projects in Latin America, and he has also worked at the climate policy consultancy Perspective, which I can add is also an ICAT partner. Michel is a founding partner of Greenwork and currently also engaged with a climate finance related PhD at the University of Flensburg. Michel has been a partner with CCAP in the work that I referred to already earlier on the ICAT Climate Finance Tracking Framework, and he will give us an overview in his keynote of the approach that they have developed. Michel, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, fellow participants of this side event today. Also a warm welcome from my side. And indeed, as Henning said, I have the pleasure to guide you through the framework that we have developed in this context of this project over the course of the last half year in cooperation with CCAP and GaussInternational. And first of all, I would like to summarize from our perspective what are the key motivations actually for transparency in the field of climate finance. All of you will have your own motivations why you would like to move that forward. But from our perspective, why transparency matters, we see on the domestic level certain objectives and benefits that can be brought with increased transparency on climate finance. First, the domestic transparency about the flows in your country, not only the budgetary ones, but also the private ones, NGO ones, everything which is not on budget. Then it helps to identify gaps in climate finance. You might experience from your countries that some sectors receive sufficient funding or even overfunding, and you have to coordinate the different initiatives there, and other sectors are prone to underfunding. And then, of course, what Henning said before, you have to measure precisely that you can manage precisely. Optimizing public resource management, that's something which can be facilitated by increased transparency in the field of climate finance. And then we also have some international level objectives and benefits that can be harnessed here. Reporting to the UNFCCC, yes, for developing countries it's voluntary. Nevertheless, it's also a chance to communicate the needs you have and also the flows that are existing in your country. And then there is other frameworks that can be coupled with a climate finance transparency framework. So a harmonized methodology is a strong benefit. And then we also know that the OECD is presenting so far the numbers on the 100 billion. It would also be a chance for developing countries to come up with their own perspective if they have harmonized methodologies on tracking climate finance. So all of that will help to mobilize additional funds at the end of the day from both domestic sources, private finance in your country, better spending of public funding in your countries, but also, of course, from international donors where you can use such a framework as a justification for the climate finance you need to support those sectors that are underfunded. And therefore, it helps at the end of the day for coordinated and efficient NDC implementation. So when we developed this guide over the course of the last year, we had a couple of considerations that were imperative for us. First of all, we wanted to produce a ready-to-use guidance for developing countries. So it's a stepwise approach that explains each step in detail. And it comes also with an Excel spreadsheet that helps those countries that do not have proper IT systems installed yet to have a fast start in the beginning. Then we also were keen to allow compatibility with other key transparency frameworks. That means, for example, the ETF under the Paris Agreement, but also the integrated national financing framework, which takes into account also development perspectives. So that was also important for us. And then a very important aspect for many countries that are not so progressed yet on building and having climate finance transparency, we wanted to allow for an evolution so that over time those systems can evolve and increase their granularity and transparency. The principles we took into account, we also know those from other transparency schemes, for example, the inventory assessments. Maximizing granularity is one aspect. Then, of course, avoiding double counting, that we do not count the same flows twice, is very important, and conservativeness in many aspects. So this is the general approach that we have come up with. It has 5 different phases. The first 2 phases are rather for preparing the framework itself, for setting up its basis. Phase 1 would be scoping and planning. Phase 2, defining the institutional setting, that you also have the institutional basis to conduct the operational activities. And those operational activities are summarized in phase 3, 4, and 5. It contains an ex-ante perspective, NDC costing, then a rather look backward with ex-post climate finance tracking, and then bringing that together to achieve the transparency results I have just talked about. We will look a bit more into detail of each of the phases. The first one, scoping and planning, consists of different activities. You would start with a country readiness assessment to see where the country currently stands, what kind of elements of such a framework are already existing, and what needs to be elaborated from scratch or where you can build on. Then comes as a second aspect the definition of climate finance. There is no universal definition on climate finance. There is different perspectives in different world regions on what climate finance actually means. And therefore, this is a very important step. And you see this little blue pyramid here, and it symbolizes that there is different approaches available to do that, and they differ by complexity. I give you an example on that. Setting the climate finance definition and taking into account the capabilities of countries can lead to different approaches. If you do not have the capabilities and if you start to define climate finance from scratch, you might use in the first run of this cycle international climate finance definitions that exist already. For example, UNFCCC has certain indications, then we have OECD and other monitoring frameworks that come up with definitions. Then level 2, a bit more complex, would be to adjust those international available methodologies according to, for example, your NDC. Bring in your local perspective and adjust that and adapt it to your local context. And then, just as an example on setting the climate finance definition, level 3 would be a very complex one. It would rather be then really creating a green taxonomy and national climate finance taxonomy that goes beyond only the climate finance definition, but also brings in some regulatory potential at the end of the day. So those different kind of options with regards to complexity appear on several steps, and we have integrated that to take into account the different capacities of the countries and their capability to start. Climate finance parameters entail, for example, the time frame for monitoring. It entails also whether you go for a project or an activity-based reporting approach, which is, again, more granularity, but also more complexity. So we have on a couple of those, again, the option for different complexity levels. And then you end up in this first phase with a work plan setting to kind of arrange the other steps that are following in the other phases, and also those steps that need to be elaborated that your climate finance transparency framework can work. So at the end of the day, you will have selected complexity levels for different elements based also on the readiness assessment, and you will have set your corresponding work priorities and work plans. And you will have a climate finance definition and parameters defined for your specific climate finance transparency cycle in your country. Second phase is also very important, the institutional setting. You need institutions that conduct and operate such a framework. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to create sustainable and robust results. So here we would start with a capacity and leadership assessment to identify those institutions that can drive forward the process and also see and identify the capacity they have and whether they are able to operate the system in a way that it's sustainable in the long run. Then also setting clear roles and responsibilities is very important. You need an understanding among the landscape of different ministries and, for example, Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment is typically the focal point for UNFCCC, that they understand which responsibility and which roles they can take over. Then some of those might not have sufficient capacity. Capacity development for some of those institutions is an important third step. And then finally, planning the operational phases 3, 4, and 5 that I will talk about in a second is the last step of this phase 2 setting. So at the end, you will have an overview of the existing institutional arrangements and capacities in your country. That is the basis to then strengthen those institutional settings for the climate finance data management and tracking. Phase 3 is looking forward. Many of you have potentially done already some sort of NDC costing, some might not. It's the ex-ante perspective to look forward how much funding you actually need in your different sectors to implement the NDC. Therefore, if you have to improve that or if you have to elaborate because it does not exist, You need setting parameters for the cost estimation. Again, we elaborate here with different complexity options. You can conduct that from a top-down approach or from a bottom-up. You would apply those parameters and then verify the cost estimations that are resulting. And that gives you then kind of the overall needs for NDC or long-term strategy implementation with regards to ex-ante planning. Phase 4 is looking backwards. It's about the ex-post perspective on climate finance tracking. So you look into the last years in your country. You collect climate finance data from different sources, again, different complexity options. For example, integrating the private sector might be very difficult. Even industrialized countries struggle with that, to have a complete overview of their climate finance landscape from all the sources. This will be the first step. Then verifying the climate finance data is also important. We have to avoid double counting. We have seen that before as one of the key principles. And then weighting climate finance data is another aspect. This is again connected then to your climate finance definition. What is for you and your country adaptation? What is mitigation? So how do you label the different flows? This is covered here in the last aspect. And at the end of this step, you will have a database containing then broad information from various sources on the climate finance flows existing in your country. Phase 5 finally brings together all the steps that we have seen before. You will bring together those needs that we have identified in phase 3 with the NDC costing, and you will also bring in the climate finance tracked over the course of the last years, and this is resulting in a gap assessment that says where, in which sectors are we underfunded, where is it sufficiently stuffed with funding. This will help them to achieve the 3 key objectives: optimizing the public resource management, mobilize additional climate finance flows, being now from domestic or from international sources, and reporting to the UNFCCC is also one of the objectives that can be achieved here in phase 5. And then last but not least, by completing the cycle, we suggest to evaluate lessons learned and to plan for the next cycle, to improve again, for example, the institutional setting, to improve some of the parameters and basic assumptions that are lying under this cycle. And this will help to increase granularity and transparency over time. So having all that in place is our hope that it really fosters strengthening NDC implementation and also allowing to come up with a proper climate finance strategy. So I summarized on the last slide again the whole cycle with all its sub-steps. You have heard a lot about that in the last minutes. I don't want to intimidate you here. It's a complex process, but as said before, there will be many options to start with a rather simplified approach, and over time it will evolve into a more complex climate finance transparency framework that helps you in the long run with your NDC implementation. I hope that is helpful to you. Thank you very much for the attention. We will have the chance to answer a couple of clarification questions right now, so please go ahead with that. And then afterwards, in the discussion with the panelists, we can also go a bit more into the methodology, and we are happy about your feedback. Thank you very much. Immediate questions?
Yeah.
Thank
you very much, Michel, and I think it was a very useful overview. It's only an overview, so there's a lot of detail at each step, and we are not going into that. But of course, what I think is important is that, first of all, you see this as an integrated approach, that you really try to integrate as much as possible with any other assessments that you have in the country, for instance, of development finance. And secondly, that you don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, and you do not get stuck with individual steps, but try to complete the cycle, get a full overview with some elements being less detailed initially, and then you decide based on that information where you want to put more emphasis. So are there any clarifying questions to Michel at this stage? We will afterwards have a discussion, so you will be able to have discussion questions later, but if you have a question of clarification, is that more a discussion question or a clarification point? We need a microphone, so please.
Maybe the clarification question. So thank you for the interesting presentation. You rightly said, Oliver Herrmann from Climate & Company, think tank on sustainable finance. So thank you for your framework. You rightly said the definition is key, and you also referred to the taxonomy. There are some existing taxonomies, so how much are they already involved in your framework? So do you refer to specific taxonomies? Do you recommend some? The elephant in the room is probably the European taxonomy, as green is some of the gas-fired power plants. That's my first question, and the others is more for discussion. So clarifications, which taxonomies do you actually recommend, or do you refer in your framework?
Well, we do not recommend a specific taxonomy because it will be country-tailored at the end of the day. We have a list of existing international taxonomies in our guides, but the full-scale sketch up and development of a taxonomy goes beyond what we present here. So we give inspiration how to do that, we give examples how to do that, but at the end of the day, this is an own very complex process to build a full-scale taxonomy. So this framework also for certain elements gives very precise detailed steps. For others, where we really have a high level of complexity to integrate those elements, it gives examples and inspirations where to start, and also refers to other guides that exist from ICAT, for example. For some of the fields, we have other guides that exist to bring forward certain methodologies, and also other institutions are referenced. So I hope that answers your question at this point of time.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add to that response that indeed this is a framework, and we are also happy to work with partners on this framework. We know that other institutions are working very specifically on, for instance, the topic of taxonomy. I know there is some idea of building an African taxonomy, and yeah, that is something that we want to make sure it can fit into the framework, but it's not necessarily our role then to have the detail, and we are very much believing in the approach of country-driven decision-making on some of those elements, so providing a framework for such decisions to be based on sound evidence. That's really the basic philosophy of this framework. Are there any other clarifying questions at this stage? If I don't see any, you can keep your discussion questions, please, because we will have time for a discussion afterwards. Oh, there's one. Une question du Côte d'Ivoire. Aimé. It's a question for later on for the discussion. We'll note it down. Yes. Thank you very much. So then let me invite the moderator of the panel discussion, Sebastian Lema, who is Climate Finance Director at CCAP. Sebastian brings over 12 years of experience on carbon markets and climate finance. He worked in the private sector for a carbon offset strategy, and he has been working at the public policy level, notably in helping to design the Colombian climate finance strategy and developing a Colombian monitoring system for climate finance flows, which of course is a very relevant experience. So Sebastian, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Henning, for the introduction, and of course, to trust us in developing this guide that we know it's a very important tool for for countries in order to track climate finance. So for this panel, I'm very pleased to invite to our two panelists. First, I would like to invite Madeleine Diouf. She's the head of the Climate Change Division at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Senegal. Madeleine Diouf Sarr is the head of the Climate Change Division, trained as biologist and environmental engineer. Ms. Sarr has 20 years of experience in UN climate change negotiations, including as a member of the consultative group of experts of national communication and the expert group and adoption committee. So please. Beyond the UNFCCC, he has experience of managing and coordinating climate change projects and programs in Senegal. Ms. Sarr serves as Senegal National Technical Coordinator on Climate Change, providing oversight of country projects under Green Climate Fund and leading the process for development of Senegal's national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. So, thank you. And secondly, I would like to invite Lennox Laden. Lennox is the Chief Climate Change Officer in the National Climate Change Office at the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management in Belize. Dr. Gladden's work at the Climate Change Office encompasses 3 main roles: to coordinate, communicate, and mainstream all climate change-related activities nationally. He is an engineer by training, with his previous work focusing on water resource management, specifically how to use, value, and manage to build resilience. He adopted a holistic approach to climate change, acknowledging that climate change should be viewed through all 3 lenses of society: the social, the environmental, and the economical. This unique approach has helped to improve a broader stakeholder engagement on what is often considered as a complex issue. So, welcome, please. Explain us briefly what are the current status of climate finance tracking in Senegal, and what are the main challenges related to this topic, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and also thank to the presenter on the reflection around the different steps in order really to monitor climate finance in our countries. I just want also to thank ICAT for this initiative, that is really what we say initiative that comes at the right moment, because we need to report back through on our NDC implementation, and we need also to work on our next NDCs. So tracking the NDC implementation is key, and also tracking the finance we receive is important. For Senegal, we have, as we say, we have a NDC that we have adopted through the government process since 2020, and we have conditional and unconditional. So this question of how to take on board conditional and unconditional, we used to raise it, and we actually also at the national level we know what is we call unconditional is what we think is domestic resource. Sometimes we can look at the terminology domestic resource, but is a resource we have under control. And what we call conditional is resource coming from external resource, coming from partner multilateral, bilateral, and also bank and all. So we are starting a process with under ICAT to see how we can track the finance use for implementing our NDCs. And the challenge we're facing, we already start the process. The challenge we might face is how to organize the collection of data. We're talking about finance, so sometimes people are having difficulties to talk about finance first. So we're trying to bring also the finance ministry. And I say that, I can say at this moment in Senegal, the Ministry of Finance include in his process what we call sustainable development finance. So I think this is really, we call it finance durable. It's now a new element that we bring in the finance category. And we, regarding the climate finance, this is part of what they call sustainable finance. So we bring climate change on board, and we need to work with them. It's why the definition of finance is important for us, because we need to say what is really climate finance, because in the terminology finance, sustainable finance, there's a lot of things. So we're looking for new and additional finance that help us to implement our NDCs, tracking emission, but also taking on board adaptation, and also taking on board loss and damage, because we're already facing loss and damage challenge. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is we have set up a small team with finance and planning ministry, and also we have what we call non-party stakeholder, so municipalities. So also it's another group of actors you have to have in, because we are part of global climate action, and how to track the resource from this local government is also something. Maybe we will need to have clarities on how we will work with them. Noting that they have national resource, domestic resource, but they have also external resource. So, as I say, data collection will be really, but I think it's good. It's a big challenge. The accuracy of data, I think it can be challenged, but I think we will look at it maybe later, but let's collect data. Let also, the issue of confidentiality for private sector is something we have to take on board. So it's also another aspect. So we have to work on linking to the nature of private sector, where this competition aspect is there. So these are elements we need to take on board when making the collection. But we do things that for all administrative data coming from the government, we can have it from the Ministry of Finance, yeah. But for the other aspect, local government, private sector, NGO, maybe NGO sometime, it might be challenging, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that you are pointing some key elements in the process of tracking climate finance. That is, of course, define the scope of climate finance. You want to consider a domestic one, or also international, even private. The point of loss and damage, that I think is something that is not evident at all at this point for climate finance in developing countries, how to track this and how to estimate it. And a third element that is related to the institutional arrangement. Yes, that is, I think it is one of the first steps that was mentioned in Mikkel's presentation, and usually is one of the process that could take a longer time before to start the system itself. And related to this point, I would like to appoint Dr. Gladden in relation to this point, how do you should coordinate with other institutions? And maybe you can tell us a little bit how has been the experience in Belize in relation to the institutional arrangement to track climate finance.
Okay. Yes, I think that first of all, I just have to express my appreciation to the Secretariat, to the team, to CCAP. Most of what I will be mentioning, actually, I'll be telling the story of where we were and where we are now. And this is as a result of direct support from ICAT. So when it comes to engagement, especially looking at the various sectors, because when we try to take the necessary steps to track climate finance, we first started out with bolstering our existing governance structure. Nationally, our structure, the office serves as a secretariat to the National Climate Change Committee, right? We do not have a legal mandate per se. However, we did have that discussion with ICAT. So now we're at the tail end of the country's first climate change bill. And it is to, of course, get over the challenge faced by many countries when it comes to sharing of data. We have informal relationships with institutions to access their, for lack of a better term, their activities. And these activities, how does the saying go? You follow the money if you want to, keep track of these initiatives. So taking that into consideration, we first of all had to develop a national MRV system, right? And that national MRV system did not take into consideration the current guidelines to track climate finance, but it enabled us to build on that existing relationship with beneficiaries, with stakeholders. And when I say beneficiaries and stakeholders, it goes across the board, right? Not only state, but non-state actors as well. We take into consideration local and indigenous communities. So we tried from the onset to take a blanketed approach to formulate, to cooperate, to integrate on such an initiative. Because for the most part, and it is always stated, do not plan for us without us, right? And that is something that was key when we wanted to track climate finance flows. To get that buy-in was to, of course, not to look at it from the perspective that it isn't an additional reporting obligation, right? And that was one of the first challenge we had to overcome with the stakeholders. They realized that it is important for them for accountability purposes, for transparency purposes, because in the absence of that, you cannot properly know if you're reaching any sort of targets, where the gaps are, as previously mentioned. And when we started off this discussion on this initiative, we took that into consideration. A mere, I'd say 3 years ago, to track climate finance flows, we had to rely on picking up the phone and calling all the sectors, all the subsectors, and asking them a simple question, all right? What's your expenditure as it relates to this activity? But even before that, they're not fully cognizant of what the climate rationale is for their activity. So how can we then tag and say, okay, something, this is investment in climate change, right? So even before we started the definition of climate finance, we had to sensitize them to say, listen, this is climate change 101, right? And that helped us immensely, that level of sensitization, because then it was a seamless transition when we took into consideration the methodology that was provided. We were in abeyance as well and doing basically desktop review to say, okay, how do we start with this? Because again, there's a climate change office, but through this process as well, there's a climate finance unit, all right? So that line of communication, for me, my background is different. I do not talk the financial talk, all right? So we had to bridge that gap, of course, and through that, we developed our national climate finance strategy. So that was all part of the governance structure to get us to this point whereby we can say that we are in a better standing as it relates to tracking climate finance flows, not only international, not only domestic, but also subnational, because we started off from the onset with focusing on that gap, which is the definition of climate change, to the point where we are right now, where we have, as a country, have a singular definition for climate finance, right? So we can compare, and it doesn't matter the sector. It doesn't matter if it's a community-based investment, but we have an inkling, we have an understanding of a general standard, and this is definitely an approach that fosters integration, right? Because as I elaborated on previously, that governance structure was our priority in bridging this gap, in bringing that level of collaboration. Even from the private sector perspective, we're now doing some simultaneous initiative, because even for them, while they have been doing a lot of investments or what they consider investment in the climate change realm, they still they don't fully understand what is the climate change rationale for that sort of investment. So while we're building out our MRV, Climate Finance MRV system platform, we're still trying to build capacity, because we realize that we cannot necessarily do a stepwise approach. Some of these initiatives needs to be done simultaneously.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn. I think you mentioned some key elements that one, I think in general, one is not start from zero, but based on the already a basis that you have in the country to track and to monitor, of course, and also the relation with the non-state actors. No, that is also a key element. You will want to have a comprehensive overview of climate finance tracking. Thank you. Now, by the end of next year, we are going to have the first submission of the biennial transparency report to the UNFCCC. So my question in this sense is, Madeleine, if for Senegal, based on the experience that you explained before, are you considering to make a submission to the biennial report, and also if you are considering climate finance on this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. We have the biennial update report. We haven't yet submit, but we close to submit. And from there, I think the issue of reporting on finance, I think, because there's a chapter where you report on the resource you receive, on transfer of technology you receive, and capacity building you have been supported. And I need to highlight that, yeah, these difficulties of reporting on the climate finance receive is there. We're putting numbers, we're putting projects, but it's really showing really the gaps on the reality on the ground. And also what we're measuring, is it effectively climate finance? So even in the report, we're having some number, but we know that what we're having is not accurate, because we can't say what is the part of climate and what is the part of development. So I think this needs to be highlighted. So from the VTR, I don't know how we're going to do it, but it's not clear yet. Yeah, so we have number, we don't know. Because I just want to highlight, because we're having grant, yeah, we're having all this support, but we're having also some loan, some concessional loan, all this coming from a bank, even from partner, bilateral. So how we will define the part of the grant, the part of the concessional loan, and also, yes, so sometimes also you will have a guarantee, because it's more and more coming. So these are things we need really to see in the coming, because the BTR will be by 2025, before we reach this period, to know how to do that. This is important. It's why it's important really to have clarities. our minister, my minister is always his form of finance. What is your definition? Why you talk about transparency if you don't have a definition? So we need that. And I think ICAT was saying, please take your definition and put it. So we will do that, but the comparability is there also, so we need to do that. So as I say, yes, we're working on that, on the beach year. We finalize the biennium uptake report. And as I say, the challenging is the quality of data, but it's a learning process, so more you exercise yourself, more you will be better. And yes, we will report on that. As I say, we have done in Senegal a lot on adaptation. You're saying we don't know how to track loss and damage, but we're paying for our loss and damage. So we will put it there. So this finance will be put there. And regarding the mitigation part, as I say, Senegal is really investing on green energy, on solar plant. So we put there. But as I say, it's not, most of them is not grant, it's also loan. So we put there. So it's part of our national strategy on long-term, what you call low carbon development. So this is how we intend to report on our NDCs. As I say, we will have some incentives, but I think this is part of a process, and progressively we will have more experience, more sharing experience, sharing methodology. We will improve, but I think, yeah, we will start by that. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you, Madeleine. I think, as you mentioned, there are going to be like a lot of challenges for this first submission, but I think it will also like a very important step on learning, and also on to differentiate like different sources of funding. If it is like a loan, non-reimbursable cooperation, of course, like the domestic budget allocation, and the point again of loss and damage that you mentioned, of course, and you include also in your response like an issue related with definitions, with like a transparency definition, because everyone is talking about like a transparency, but maybe we don't have like a common definition on this. And I think this also applies sometimes with to climate finance, that everyone is talking about climate finance, but it's not like a universal definition for climate finance. And as Mikkel explained in his presentation, this is also one of the first steps to start to look like a tracking climate finance system within a country. So, Dr. Gladden, I don't know if you have like have this internal conversation in Belize to define what is and what is not climate finance?
Yes. And in my previous intervention, I spoke about it quite calmly. But really, the exercise was quite daunting to come up with a definition, for a singular definition for climate finance. I mentioned earlier, I work within the ministry that is considered the Environment Ministry. So my definition of climate finance differs from the Ministry of Economics and Development definition of climate finance, right? So how do we overcome that? Well, our first step, we hired someone from the finance sector, right, to come and work on our ministry, right, to have that common language, right? So with our climate finance MRV officer, right, he was able to sit across from the banking institutions, sit across from development corporation, and enable them to have that level of understanding. Because for them, climate finance, oh, okay, it's climate finance, but that's an environmental issue, right? And that's not necessarily the case. So that was the first step that we actually embark on to try and have that singular definition of climate finance. So we got a lot of participation from actors, from stakeholders that were quite foreign to us, right? Usually when we are building capacity, we do not have anybody from the central bank, right? They're not there, right? Because for them, okay, we don't want to talk about inventories, greenhouse gas inventory, that doesn't have anything to do with us, right? We have from Development Finance Corporation as well. We had participation from the Belize Livestock Producers Association, and they have 5,000 members, and you know that sector is sometimes stated as a high emitting sector. And they were there discussing, from their vantage point, what is climate finance, right? But apart from that, it's more of an end user type of activity. The climate finance, what is it going to be used for, right? Is it just a definition? What's the purpose of the definition, right? Because they have to have a value, right, in order for them to get that buy-in. In the absence of that, it is going to always be an isolated exercise, right? So I think the key to the whole formulation of that singular definition, and it had several iterations, right? Several draft 0, I think we're probably at draft 50 something right now, right? But at least we're agreeing to that draft, not like, certain thematic areas, right? Right? At least we're agreeing to one common definition as it relates to climate finance, right? So I think that level of engagement, having discussions with what I consider non-traditional stakeholders, that is key. In the absence of that, going forward is going to be extremely problematic because, like I said, from the onset, we had to have that level of engagement, right? And it's not to invite the common actors, those maybe from fisheries, those maybe from blue economy, right? No, we had to target those who actually deal with finance flows to the point where we are right now, that we're actually getting participation from the Ministry of Finance to see now how they can transition from only public sector investment program to do some sort of climate tagging within our national budgeting system. So that is the importance of trying to bridge these gaps in this process.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn. I think that, from that we can take like important learnings to implement in the guide. I mean, that is basically to consider like the other actors that are not usually like the suspected ones. Of course. Thank you very much. So thank you for this interesting discussion. I think we have like a very important topics to be considered in the development of the guide. But I would like to ask you to stay here for like a Q&A session with the audience. And in addition to that, I would like to invite, please, Dr. Hennig to join us in the panel, as well as Mikkel. Okay, perfect. So now they have like a country representatives and also Dr. Hennig from the international cooperation perspective and Mikkel. The idea is to have like a row of 3 questions, and then the idea is to answer. If maybe like the person that is asking the question have like an indication of who should answer it. Otherwise, we can try to solve between all the panel members. Thank you. So. Now, if somebody wants to ask a question, please. Okay. Oh, yeah. Perfect.
Merci beaucoup aux organisateurs de l'événement. Ma question doit s'adresser au représentant du Sénégal, Madame Madeleine. Vous avez parlé d'une équipe que vous avez mise en place avec le ministère du Plan, le ministère de l'Économie. Voilà. Je voulais savoir quel est le défi que vous avez rencontré pendant la mise en place de l'équipe et comment vous avez fait pour pouvoir relever ce défi. Merci.
Yes, maybe we can ask 3 questions before, and then you can answer, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. Aarti Gupta from Wageningen University. This is a question for Belize. You said that a definition of climate finance is not, there should be a purpose to it. What's the point? And you said that, what is it going to be used for? So how did you eventually come to an answer to that? I was just curious about that. And then you also mentioned that you got the Ministry of Finance involved, and that actually now in the national budgeting system, if I understood this correctly, there's some climate tagging. So is that the purpose of the climate finance definition? Or also, this sounds like mobilizing domestic climate finance to implement NDCs rather than international. So maybe you could just comment on that. Thank you.
One last question. Oh, I think she was first. Oh, he was first. Sorry.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Jane. I'm from Haiti. I am the CBIT project manager and the transparency focal point. My question is for Mrs. Diouf. What are the key learning lessons you could share with us when you are implementing your MLV system? Thank you.
Who was first?
I think we're going to respond like those 3 questions, and then we have have another row. So Madeleine, if you want to start, please.
Merci pour la question concernant les défis auxquels on a eu à faire en face pour mettre en place le cadre institutionnel. J'avoue qu'on a commencé avec un readiness, avec une banque de la place, un readiness Fonds vert climat. Et dans ce readiness, on a fait une étude sur la mobilisation des ressources pour la mise en œuvre de la contribution déterminée nationale du Sénégal. Donc, c'est un travail qui nous a permis, avec le ministère des Finances, de se retrouver, mais aussi d'avoir aussi les banques et les autres acteurs ensemble. Et à l'issue de ça, il a été recommandé de mettre en place un cadre pour suivre la mise en œuvre, en tout cas les aspects financiers de la mise en œuvre de la CDN. Ça, c'est un point. L'autre aspect, donc, c'est également, on a la question de la finance durable, dont j'ai dit tout à l'heure, qui est devenue un point que le ministère des Finances suit et a mis en place une équipe autour de la finance durable, en sachant que dans la finance durable, le climat est dedans, mais il y a d'autres aspects qui sont dedans. Et donc, nous avons demandé à ce que nous soyons ensemble pour travailler sur la mise en œuvre de la CDN. Je tiens à dire, travailler ensemble sur la mise en œuvre de la CDN. C'est vrai que ça va être pas évident, je le reconnais. On a fait quelques réunions pour définir ensemble, en tout cas pour partager notre définition de la finance climatique, qui est différent pour moi de la finance durable. Donc parfois, c'est parce que pour nous, la finance climatique, c'est l'adaptation, c'est les projets d'atténuation. Et quand on parle de projets d'atténuation, c'est les émissions. Quand on parle de l'adaptation, c'est un changement par rapport à une mise en œuvre classique, que je dis business as usual, et une autre façon de faire. Si je prends l'agriculture, le fait de faire des variétés adaptées et de les distribuer au niveau national, pour moi, ce coût additionnel, c'est de la finance climatique, c'est de l'adaptation. Donc, c'est ça sur lequel nous travaillons avec eux. Maintenant, Nous avons eu aussi à mettre ce qu'on appelle une base de données, donc une méthodologie, où on essaie de voir avec chaque secteur, où on a des points focaux, pour qu'ils nous donnent les données des projets qu'ils ont. Après, peut-être il y aura cet exercice de voir qu'est-ce qui est projet d'adaptation et qu'est-ce qui n'est pas projet d'adaptation, qu'est-ce qui est projet d'atténuation ou pas, ou projet perte et dommages. Donc, et tout ça, bon, ça va nous permettre, en tout cas pour chaque secteur, et nous avons demandé au ministère des Finances d'être avec nous. Donc, ils ont vu le modèle, ils sont intéressés de suivre avec nous pour voir comment nous collectons ces informations. Maintenant, l'autre aspect qui est assez compliqué, c'est que le ministère des Finances signe parfois directement des contrats avec les partenaires, par exemple la Banque mondiale, FMI, le bilatéral. Donc, l'idée aussi, c'est vraiment, et c'est là où c'est challenging, c'est de veiller avec eux à ce que nous puissions suivre ces ressources pour voir un peu, est-ce que ces ressources sont complètement climatiques ou ce sont des ressources climat et développement. Donc, c'est là où on aura un peu de difficulté. Hein, comment, puisque c'est eux qui signent directement, comment faire la part? C'est pour ça que la différenciation est importante. Comment on va essayer de faire la part entre ce qui est climat et ce qui est développement? Et c'est là où vraiment aussi la définition est nécessaire pour qu'on se l'impose et qu'aussi on le partage avec nos partenaires pour leur dire, ça nous permettra, nous, de savoir qu'est-ce qui est réellement finance climatique et ce qu'on doit rendre compte par rapport au dispositif de UNFCCC et de l'accord de Paris. Et je pense que c'est là où on va se rendre compte que ce n'est pas évident. Mais je pense que c'est l'exercice, la pertinence de cet exercice avec ICAT pour installer ce dispositif au niveau national. Merci. Je dois répondre au deuxième?
Yes,
OK. Les leçons apprises. Bon, nous, on est au ministère de l'Environnement. Donc, nous avons au niveau national une comité nationale donc, qui est multi-acteur avec le secteur privé. J'avoue que chaque acteur a son rôle. La commission nationale est importante parce que ça nous donne un poids. Parce qu'il est parfois très difficile de dire que le ministère de l'Environnement a cette force. Actuellement, on est un peu sur la question finance, on est avec le ministère des Finances. Nous, on essaie vraiment pour qu'il ne nous écarte pas. Et c'est beaucoup de réunions, beaucoup de confrontements avec eux. C'est un aspect. Mais ce qui est important, c'est qu'au niveau national, nous avons établi depuis plus de 10 ans un comité national. Donc, qui fait qu'on a les acteurs, on a des secteurs privés, on a les universités, et on veut maintenir ça. Et chaque fois qu'on est avec le ministère des Finances, on amène les experts de ce comité pour qu'ils donnent un peu une force, en tout cas, à ce que nous disons. Parce que le ministère des Finances est très fort. Hein, et souvent, il n'écoute pas les autres ministères. Hein. C'est du top-down comme ce n'est pas possible. Hein. Moi, je fais des réunions, parfois je dis on va bientôt me chasser de ce système. Mais c'est un peu ça. Donc, c'est un ministère très fort. Donc, il faut qu'ils arrivent à comprendre, qu'ils nous accompagnent et aussi nous écoutent. Je pense que c'est ce comité-là qui nous donne une force. Mais également, je pense que le travail que nous avons fait est aussi important parce que nous avons fait les communications nationales, nous avons fait plein de choses que eux, peut-être, ils ne suivaient pas, qu'ils veulent maintenant suivre. Donc, on a une vitesse par rapport à eux. Et ce n'est pas des techniques. C'est des financiers, mais ce n'est pas des techniques. Ce n'est pas des techniciens de l'adaptation, ce ne sont pas des techniciens des inventaires. Donc, nous les ramenons toujours au service technique, parce que aussi, la leçon apprise, c'était qu'il faut veiller à ce que chaque service technique, que ce soit l'agriculture, que ce soit l'élevage, que ce soit l'énergie, soit que vous leur donnez aussi les moyens d'être en mesure de pouvoir aussi dialoguer avec les partenaires. Donc, nous, bon, en tout cas, c'est l'approche que nous avons utilisée. Et bon, on est confiant maintenant parce qu'on se dit, le climat, tous les sectoriels au Sénégal savent ce que c'est le climat. Et chacun peut, dans son secteur, faire son travail. Maintenant, l'autre challenge que nous avons, ce sont les collectivités locales. C'est plus compliqué. Je ne vais pas être long. Je pense que ça mérite vraiment d'avoir un travail ensemble pour éviter trop de confusion, surtout sur le reporting. Les maires sont forts et chacun est fort là où il est. Donc, nous, on a 500 et quelques maires, je ne sais pas quoi faire. Donc, je vais m'arrêter là, je pense. Hein. Mais bon, c'est toujours beaucoup d'efforts pour tous nos pays. I hope you get me. You raise your question in... Ah oui, donc je vous ai répondu, vous avez compris. Merci, je pensais que vous étiez... Merci.
Okay.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Thank you, madam. And Dr. Vlad, the question that was...
Yes, in response to the why, right? For them, they decided, they took stock of what they're currently doing, the respective institutions, and they said the importance of accountability. That's one, why they prefer a singular definition, and also for policy implementation, right? And it helps. The second, as a response to your second question, that was one example. The process, each institution, each organization, be it state or non-state, because as a country, for the most part, when it comes to resiliency building, we are doing a lot, we've been doing a lot, but because we do not have the adequate nomenclature, then it's hard to know, right? So from the perspective of the Ministry of Finance, they're looking at climate tagging to see, okay, from the public purse, how much investment are we actually making, right? In the climate change realm. And that is not only for national, but it helps with accountability when you're trying to access international funds. Because for us, we rely heavily on international funds for action on the ground. The Ministry of Health, their takeaway from the process, a singular climate finance definition would help them with project formulation. The Chamber of Commerce, which is more private sector, it represents the private sector. For them, out of the process of having a singular definition, that would help them with the climate rationale. So again, different actors, their takeaway, for the most part, it is different, right? Because even at the Chamber of Commerce, what they took away from it was the importance of vulnerability assessment, right? And they linked that to climate finance and climate finance flows. But they all agreed that for them to have meaningful action, that singular definition would help them with accountability and policy implementation. Project formulation, surprisingly, was secondary, right? For them, at the forefront, they want to be a little bit more accountable because it's the understanding that by them being more accountable in the process, that would naturally trigger resource mobilization, right? Not only financial, but technical. So we're transparent in this process. We're not double dipping from multiple funds to do a singular activity, and that is the way they approach it, and that was different takeaways from the different institutions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Another other hands raised before, but unfortunately we only have 3 minutes left. So my invitation is maybe you want to approach the panelists after the event. But before to close it, I would like to invite Dr. Henny for some closing remarks, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, to you, Sebastian, for moderating, and then to the 2 excellent panelists. I always feel when you have such a conversation, the time flies. I think we could have gone on for in a very useful conversation for much longer, but 90 minutes are over, so that has been much quicker than I expected. And it shows the richness of the contributions and the discussion. I think we've really heard how the different phases of what Michel presented as the framework become a reality when you actually do it in the country. I mean, definition was receiving a lot of attention, and that's, of course, phase one. It's the foundation to understand what you're actually talking about, to get a common definition. And then data collection is phases 3 and 4 on both sides of finance needs or finance flowing. The institutional arrangements are critical, which is phase 2. And then, of course, everything comes together in phase 5 when you evaluate what you have learned and use it. And there, I think the message we just heard was that if you understand the landscape in the country, the full landscape, and you can show that level of accountability, you're much better positioned to actually mobilize finance, whether it is from international sources or even from private investors. If they see that there is a scheme that actually helps to position finance in a productive direction, then they are much more eager to support, and you can direct them in a more effective way. So I think this was a great discussion. For us, one of the secret purposes of moving on this forward is actually to bring ministries of environment more actively into this discussion, because I've seen conversations guided by Ministry of Finance, which of course are great on the finance side, but they don't understand what climate needs in the countries. And so both sides need to be there. So this integration of ministries of finance and ministries of environment, and of course the same in terms of the stakeholders, is absolutely key. For us as ICAT, we see transparency as a process, and the process starts with, for instance, discussing how you define things and how do you operationalize then a definition in order to actually collect data in a consistent and meaningful way. We had 2 days ago an extremely interesting discussion on tracking just transitions. And there are very many discussions on what actually is the just transition. But when you talk about indicators, you actually make it operational, and you have a good conversation that can be constructive in moving this forward. And we had trade unions and others really confirming that this is the way. And the same applies to climate finance. You can make, with transparency, you can make a process much more constructive and operational, and move it forward. So I see a lot of room for more discussion. I think it would be great if we can bring together more countries to exchange this experience. That's certainly something that ICAT wants to do, and we will do. And we'd be really keen to hear from other countries who want to join that conversation. I mentioned at the beginning there was the idea of perhaps developing an African climate finance taxonomy. This is something that we wouldn't do, but we would be happy to facilitate if countries are interested in doing something like this. So I see very much that this was just the start of a conversation, but I think a very interesting one. And many thanks again to the speakers. Special thanks to our hosts from the Côte d'Ivoire. Really appreciated that you were able to join us and to actually host this event. And we look forward to working with all of you in the coming months and years. Thank you so much.
Thank you.